Please leave a comment where you are watching from. I used to work for the County Historic Preservation Office in northern Georgia, not too far from the Tennessee line. It was the kind of job that didn't feel like a job most of the time, quiet, slow-paced, and deeply connected to the land. My main responsibilities were maintaining and monitoring several old, county-owned properties, mostly antebellum homes, barns, and Civil War-era sites scattered through the mountains and hollers. One of the benefits that came with the position was room and board. They offered on-site lodging to caretakers willing to live full-time on the properties. I accepted, thinking it would save me rent and give me the peace and quiet I'd been craving. I'd had enough of roommates, traffic, and the general noise of town life. They assigned me to the Winstead Estate, a 5-acre parcel tucked off a barely marked road, about 30 minutes from the nearest gas station. The property had been donated to the county by the last surviving member of the Winstead family, who'd insisted it be preserved and never sold. The main house was a massive, red brick mansion built in 1817, 2 chimneys for columns, and a widow's walk-up top that overlooked the forest. I didn't live in the mansion itself, though. I stayed in the caretaker's house just beyond the main garden, a squat, 1-story cottage with creaky floors and a wood stove that barely worked. The area was remote enough that the county had gone to some effort to secure the property. After a few incidents with trespassers and vandals, kids trying to break in, tag the walls, steal old tools, they'd installed an 8-foot-tall chain-link fence around the entire perimeter, topped with barbed wire. There was one entrance, a steel gate with a padlock, about 100 yards from the house. You had to drive down a gravel path that curved between the old smokehouse and a collapsed barn to reach the clearing where the caretaker's house sat. I'm telling you all this to paint the picture clearly. Once I locked that gate behind me, no one could get in or out without serious effort. The fence was solid. The woods were thick, and I was the only person for miles. It was early November when it happened, cool, damp, the air filled with that smell of old leaves and wood smoke. I'd been working late at a different site that day, cataloging some stone foundations near the river. By the time I got back to the Winstead property, the sun was gone and the sky was a deep shade of blue-black. No lights at the gate, no lights along the road. Just the beams of my headlights cutting through the dark. And that's when things started to feel wrong. I turned off the gravel road and started down the path toward the house. The headlights bounced slightly with each dip and bump in the terrain. The woods on either side of the road were thick and black, swallowing sound. Nothing out here ever echoed. Everything just got absorbed into the pine and dirt. The only sound was the crunch of tires over gravel and the hum of the engine. As I rounded the bend near the old tool shed, the beams of my headlights swept across the clearing, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a deer. That was the only thing my mind could come up with in those first few seconds. It had the size, the shape. It was standing still, just off to the right of the path, maybe 20 or 30 feet from where I'd be parking. But something wasn't right. It wasn't grazing. It wasn't moving like a deer would. It wasn't even facing away like they usually are when they bolt at the sound of a car. No, this thing was staring at me, straight into the beams of the headlights. And then I realized something else. Its limbs were too long. Thin, spindly, but strong, like the bones were built for something other than walking on 4 legs. Its body was covered in hair, but not like a deer's coat. This was long and stringy, matted in places, hanging in clumps. The closest thing I could compare it to was a maned wolf, but even that didn't sit right. It stood taller than a wolf, and its posture was strange, hunched, as if it were crouching but ready to spring. I sat there in the driver's seat, frozen, the engine idling. I don't know how long I stared, maybe 10 seconds, maybe 20. Then I made a mistake. I opened the door. I didn't step out all the way. I just cracked it open slowly, thinking maybe I could get a better look. Maybe it was tangled in something. Maybe it was hurt. Hell, maybe it wasn't even real, and my eyes were just playing tricks on me after a long day. But the second that door creaked open, it moved. Not away. Not toward me. It rose up. It stood. I know how that sounds. I do. But I watched it. I watched this thing straighten its back, shift its weight, and rise, until it was standing on 2 legs. It wasn't natural. It wasn't like a bear rearing up. It was smoother than that. More balanced. It stood there for a heartbeat, maybe 2. And then it ran. Not like a panicked animal. Not like something bounding off into the woods. It sprinted, on 2 legs, toward the far end of the property, vanishing into the shadows beyond the shed and the treeline. I slammed the door shut and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely shift the car into park. For a second, I just sat there, gripping the wheel, staring at the spot where it had stood. Then I remembered the fence. 8 feet. Chain link. Topped with barbed wire. Completely surrounding the property. I'd locked the gate myself not 5 minutes earlier. There was no way in. No way out. I finally got out of the car, slowly, flashlight in one hand and my keys in the other. My boots crunched on the gravel as I walked to the front door of the cottage. I unlocked it, stepped inside, and immediately went to the closet by the door. I kept a 12-gauge Mossberg in there, mostly for critters, coyotes, maybe the occasional snake too close to the house. I grabbed it and loaded 2 shells. I spent the next hour sweeping the property. Nothing. Not a track. Not a sound. Not a single broken branch or disturbed leaf. I circled the sheds, checked the fence line, even climbed the porch of the main house and swept my flashlight across the yard. It was dead quiet. Still. Even the frogs and insects had gone silent. I eventually gave up and went back inside. But I didn't sleep. I sat on my couch, shotgun across my lap, staring at the window. I kept imagining that thing, whatever it was, coming back. Standing outside the window. Pressing its face to the glass. Watching. And the worst part, I still couldn't explain how it had gotten in. Morning came, eventually. I must have dozed off sometime around 5, because when I opened my eyes, the first light was already seeping through the blinds. The shotgun was still in my lap, my neck sore from sleeping upright. Everything looked normal, or as normal as things can look after what happened the night before. I didn't go into work that day. I called my supervisor and told him I wasn't feeling well, which wasn't a lie. I felt sick in a way I couldn't really name. Part anxiety, part exhaustion, part creeping sense of dread. All I could think about was that thing. The way it stood. The way it ran. The way it didn't make a sound when it moved. After a cup of coffee and a cold shower I didn't fully enjoy, I stepped outside. The morning mist still hung low over the fields, softening the edges of everything. I walked the whole perimeter of the fence again, this time in daylight. I checked every inch of it, looking for breaks in the links, gaps at the bottom, anything that might explain how something that size could have gotten in. Nothing. The fence was solid. The barbed wire was intact. No branches had fallen across it. No signs of digging beneath it. Not even a single footprint near the gate. I even checked the gate lock to make sure I hadn't imagined closing it the night before. But there it was, padlocked and secure, just as I remembered. I started thinking maybe I'd hallucinated the whole thing. Maybe it was a trick of the shadows. Maybe I'd seen a deer mid-leap, and my brain had twisted it into something else. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more my gut told me that wasn't it. No hallucination stands up on 2 legs and runs like a man. I spent the rest of that day walking the woods, just outside the fence line. There's a narrow trail that loops behind the estate and leads to an old creek bed. Used to be part of a wagon road in the 1800s, long since overgrown. I followed that path for hours, stopping every so often to listen, to look for anything out of place. There was a weird stillness in the woods that day. Not just quiet. Woods are always quiet, but this was different. No birdsong. No rustling squirrels. Even the wind seemed to have stalled. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I found nothing. No fur, no tracks, no broken limbs. Just trees and moss and that thick, heavy silence. Back at the house, I started writing everything down, every detail I could remember. I sketched out what I'd seen, poorly, on the back of a property inspection form. Something about the act of writing it out made me feel a little more in control, even if I had no answers. But that night, I didn't sleep in the bedroom. I stayed on the couch again, shotgun within arm's reach. I left the porch light on, which I never used before. I even pulled the blinds, something I hadn't done in the 3 months I'd lived there. I didn't want to see out. More importantly, I didn't want anything to see in. The second night was quieter. No sightings. No strange sounds. But the unease hadn't left. It had just changed shape, gone from fear to anticipation. I kept waiting for something to happen. Every creak of the floorboards made my skin prickle. Every gust of wind that rattled the cottage made me flinch. I started sleeping with my boots on. By the 3rd day, I'd stopped telling myself it was a one-time thing. Something had been on that property. Something that shouldn't have been able to get in. And I had no idea whether it had left. The days passed and nothing happened. That should have made me feel better, but it didn't. The silence felt too deliberate, like whatever I'd seen was waiting. Or watching. I tried to go back to routine, repairing a busted shutter on the mansion, cataloging some of the old furniture in the attic, clearing brush at the back end of the garden. But I couldn't focus. Every time I turned my back to the woods, I felt eyes on the back of my neck. I kept my shotgun close, even when I was working. I told myself it was just for peace of mind, but the truth was I didn't feel safe without it. I stopped inviting friends out to visit, stopped answering most of my calls. I didn't want to explain what I'd seen. I didn't even know how to explain it to myself. And what if talking about it made it worse? What if acknowledging it gave it more power than it already had? Then, on the 7th night, it came back. I hadn't been sleeping well, just dozing in fits and starts. Around 2:30 or 3 in the morning, I woke up to a sound I couldn't immediately place. Not loud, just enough to pull me out of that foggy half-sleep and make me sit up. It was a scraping noise. Not sharp, like claws on metal. Softer, like something brushing against fabric or wood. I held my breath and waited. The cottage was quiet. I looked over at the shotgun leaning against the wall, then got up slowly and crossed the room. I pressed my ear to the front door. There it was again. A slow drag like fingers across the porch railing. I backed away from the door and grabbed the gun. I turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it might give me away. I stepped toward the window and, careful not to touch the blinds, peeked through the gap. The porch light was still on, but the porch was empty. I held my breath and scanned the yard, the path, the trees. Nothing. Then, just as I was about to step away, I saw it. Not on the porch. Not in the yard. Up in the trees. It was perched on a low branch of the oak that stood about 15 feet from the house, just high enough to be partially obscured by shadow. Its limbs were long and thin, almost spider-like, bent at impossible angles. The light caught the edge of its face, if you could call it that. No fur this time. Just pale, stretched skin and 2 dark, glistening eyes that didn't blink. It was watching me. I don't know how long we stared at each other. It didn't move. Neither did I. Then it did something that made my blood run cold. It mimicked me. It tilted its head to the left, just slightly, exactly the way I had. Then it did it again, sharper this time, as if mocking me. I stumbled back from the window, knocking over the lamp. The crash broke the silence like a gunshot. I raised the shotgun, not even sure what I was aiming at anymore. When I looked back through the window, it was gone. I waited the rest of the night, gun in hand, eyes darting from window to window. But it never came back, not that night. The next morning, I went outside to check the tree. There were no marks on the bark. No broken branches. Nothing to suggest something had climbed it. I checked the porch. That's where I found the scratch marks. 6 long, shallow grooves along the railing, spaced like fingers. They hadn't been there the day before. I was sure of it. That was when I decided I had to leave. I didn't quit the job outright. I told the county I needed a break. That the isolation was getting to me. They were understanding, gave me a month off, no questions asked. I packed up my truck that afternoon. Before I left, I walked the property one last time. I didn't see it again, but I felt it, like the trees were watching me, like the house itself was holding its breath. I locked the gate behind me and didn't look back. It's been 4 years since I left the Winstead estate. I never went back. The county eventually reassigned the caretaker position to someone else. I don't know who. I didn't ask. Sometimes I go online and check the local forums for that area, just to see if anyone's posted anything strange. So far, nothing. No sightings. No complaints. No reports of odd noises or strange animals. But I think about that place more often than I'd like to admit. I think about the thing I saw. I think about how it moved, how it watched, how it mimicked me, and I wonder if it was ever really gone, or if it's just waiting for the right night to come back. I was 23 when I found the cabin. I dropped out of college a few months before and spent that summer drifting, working odd jobs, sleeping on friends' couches, driving long stretches of highway at night just to feel like I was getting somewhere. I didn't tell anyone where I was going when I left town that August. Not even my mom. I just packed a bag, grabbed my tent and my tools, and headed north. My plan was vague at best. Find a quiet place to think, maybe camp out for a while, try to get my head straight. I'd been feeling untethered ever since I left school. There was this constant pressure in my chest, like I was being pulled towards something I couldn't name. I thought the woods might help. I ended up somewhere in the Appalachians, maybe 20 miles off the main road. I'm not even sure what state I was in. Could have been western North Carolina, maybe eastern Tennessee. I'd taken a lot of back routes, and the map I had was old and half-torn. There was a dirt road that looped off into the trees, and I followed it until it narrowed into something more like a trail. Eventually, I parked the car, slung my pack over my shoulder, and walked. The forest there was dense, green in a way that felt heavy. The kind of green that soaks into your skin. Moss hung from the trees, and the air buzzed with the hum of insects and distant birdsong. After about an hour of hiking, I found a clearing. It was shaded and quiet, with a soft bed of pine needles and a small stream trickling nearby. But I didn't pitch my tent, because the cabin was already there. It sat just beyond a ring of trees, tilted slightly to one side, as if the ground had shifted beneath it. The roof sagged in the middle, and the front door hung open, swinging gently in the breeze. One shutter had come loose, and was resting on the porch. Vines crept up the sides, but the structure itself looked intact, old but not ruined. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. I should have turned around. I should have walked back to the car, driven into town, and found a motel. But something about the cabin felt still, silent in a way that wasn't threatening, like it had been waiting for me. I stepped inside. The floor creaked under my boots. Dust floated in the air, catching the late afternoon light that filtered through the cracks in the walls. There was a small table, an old iron stove, a cot with a moth-eaten blanket. It smelled like cedar and mildew, but not in a bad way. Just old, like the place had been forgotten. I checked every corner. No signs of animals. No droppings. No nests. No graffiti or beer cans or evidence of squatters. It didn't look like anyone had been there in years. I set my pack down and decided to stay the night. That first night was uneventful. I lit a small fire in the stove using dry twigs and old newspaper I'd brought with me. Ate a can of beans. Read a few pages of a book I'd been carrying around, but never actually started. When it got dark, it got really dark. No streetlights. No distant traffic. Just the sound of the wind and the occasional crack of a branch outside. I slept surprisingly well. The next morning, I felt better than I had in months. I made coffee over the fire, walked down to the stream, and washed my face in the cold water. I spent the afternoon patching a hole in the cabin wall with some scrap, what I found out back. It felt good to work with my hands, to fix something tangible. By the third day, I'd started calling it my place. It didn't feel like I was squatting. It felt like I'd found something that had been waiting for me to return. I know how that sounds, but that's the best way I can put it. Around sunset, I started seeing the light. It wasn't dramatic, just a soft orange glow that flickered outside the cabin around dusk. At first, I thought it was the sun catching the trees just right, but it didn't move with the sun. It hovered. It pulsed. Always just outside the clearing, just beyond the tree line. I walked toward it once, thinking maybe it was fireflies or a reflection. But when I got within 10 feet of the trees, it vanished. No sound, no movement, just gone. I stood there for a while, trying to understand what I'd seen. But the trees were dark and quiet, and the glow didn't come back that night. The next evening it returned. This time it was closer. It hovered behind a thin line of trees, maybe 30 yards from the cabin. It didn't flicker like fire. It wasn't warm or dangerous. It was curious. That's the word that came to mind. It felt like it was watching me, studying me, trying to decide something. I didn't go after it this time. I just sat on the porch and watched it back. Eventually it drifted away, and I felt calm. Not afraid. Not even confused. Just calm. That night, I dreamed of the cabin. Not as it was, but as it might have looked 100 years ago. Fresh logs, smoke rising from the chimney, a rocking chair on the porch. I dreamed of someone walking through the woods, someone tall and thin, with a lantern that glowed the same color as the light I'd seen. They didn't speak, just nodded at me, like they were acknowledging something. I woke up with tears on my face. I don't know why. By the 6th day, I stopped checking my phone for service. I stopped thinking about where I was or how to get back. The cabin had become home, not a place I was visiting, but a place I'd always belonged. I started hearing things in the woods. Not voices exactly, more like whispers, soft and rhythmic, like the wind through tall grass, but with purpose. I'd hear them at dusk, when the light returned. They came from different directions each night. Always just far enough away that I couldn't make out words. Always just close enough that I knew they were real. I wasn't scared. I should have been. But the longer I stayed, the more those sounds felt familiar, like the forest was speaking a language I used to know. On the 8th night, I didn't light the fire. I sat in the dark, waiting. The light came again, brighter this time. It hovered just beyond the porch, low to the ground, swaying slightly. I stood in the doorway and watched it. It moved closer. I didn't move. The whispers grew louder, but they weren't hostile. They felt like an invitation, a welcome. The light stopped 5 feet from the porch, and then it rose slowly, steadily, until it hovered at eye level. I looked into it, and for a moment I saw something inside it. A shape. A face. I'm not sure. It shimmered like heat rising from asphalt, shifting constantly. It felt familiar, like something I'd seen in a dream I'd forgotten. Then it blinked out. No sound. No warning. Just gone. The forest fell silent. I stood there for a long time, listening to my heartbeat. The next morning, I packed my things. Not because I was afraid. Because I knew if I stayed one more day, I wouldn't leave. I took one last walk around the clearing. Ran my hand along the cabin's rough wooden frame. I whispered, "Thank you," without really knowing why. Then I left. I didn't take anything but my pack. I didn't look back. The car was where I left it. The drive out felt longer than I remembered. The road had changed somehow, more overgrown, less defined. I had to stop twice to move fallen branches. When I got back to town, everything felt loud and harsh. The air was too dry. The light too bright. I checked into a motel and slept for 15 hours straight. I didn't tell anyone about the cabin. Not for a long time. I used to work for the County Historical Society in the Ozarks, a job that involved restoring and maintaining old buildings and properties owned by the county. I'd always been fascinated by history, and working hands-on with these old structures had a way of making me feel connected to something much bigger than myself. One of the perks of the job was living on-site at one of the historic properties. It wasn't glamorous, but I loved it. The property where I lived was tucked away deep in the backwoods, far from town and surrounded by dense forest on all sides. At the heart of the property stood an imposing stone manor, built in the 1830s, with high arched windows and ivy creeping up its weathered walls. It had been vacant for decades before the county acquired it, and though I didn't live in the manor itself, I often found myself staring at it, imagining what life had been like there nearly 2 centuries ago. My home was a modest caretaker's cottage about 30 feet from the main house, nestled among the trees. It was small but cozy, and I liked the solitude. Because of the property's isolation and its historical value, the county had gone to great lengths to secure it. They had built a 9-foot-tall chain-link fence around the entire 6-acre property, topped with razor wire. There was only one entrance gate, which I kept locked at all times. With the fence and the security measures in place, the property was like a fortress. It seemed impossible for anyone, or anything, to get in without my knowledge. But sometimes, when you're in a place that remote, the quiet can play tricks on you. The woods around the property were dense and alive with the sounds of nature. At night, the calls of distant owls and the rustling of leaves in the breeze could make you feel like you weren't quite as alone as you thought. I told myself it was just my imagination, until one night, when I learned that the woods held secrets I wasn't prepared to face. It was late autumn, and the days were growing shorter. I had spent most of the afternoon working at another historic site, a church about 10 miles away, and by the time I finished up and drove back to the property, it was already dark. The drive home was uneventful, as always. The narrow dirt road that led to the property was lined with towering pines that seemed to close in around my truck as I drove. The only light came from my headlights, cutting through the darkness like a knife. When I reached the gate, I got out to unlock it, my breath hanging in the cold night air. The woods were silent, save for the crunch of gravel beneath my boots and the faint rustling of leaves overhead. I swung the gate open, drove through, and stopped to lock it behind me before continuing down the dirt lane to the cottage. The property was completely unlit, so the only illumination came from my truck's headlights. The gravel road wound past the manor and a few smaller outbuildings before ending at my cottage. As I turned the corner near an old barn, my headlights swept across the gravel parking area in front of the cottage, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a deer. It was standing near the edge of the gravel, its long legs silhouetted against the trees. But as my lights hit it head-on, I realized it wasn't a deer at all. The creature was tall, much taller than a deer, with unnaturally long, spindly legs and a body covered in coarse, shaggy fur. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like it wasn't used to being on land. It reminded me of a maned wolf, but distorted, stretched out, almost like a caricature of an animal. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no way something that size could have gotten onto the property. The fence was too high, and the razor wire would have torn through anything that tried to climb it. Yet here it was, standing in my headlights, its long, matted fur glinting in the light. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. I was too stunned to react, and the creature seemed to be staring back at me, though I couldn't see its eyes clearly. Then slowly it shifted its weight, its body swaying slightly as if it was trying to decide what to do next. I don't know what came over me, but I opened the door and stepped out of the truck, wanting to get a better look. As soon as I moved, the creature turned sharply, its back arching as it rose onto its hind legs. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it stand upright, its long legs stretching out beneath it. It was easily 7 feet tall, maybe taller, and its movements were unnervingly human-like. And then it ran. When I say it ran, I mean it sprinted, on 2 legs. Its strides were impossibly long, and within seconds it had disappeared into the darkness beyond the reach of my headlights. I stood there, staring after it, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just seen. Once the initial shock wore off, fear set in. I climbed back into the truck, locked the doors, and drove the remaining distance to the cottage as fast as I could. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle of leaves a potential sign that the creature had returned. When I reached the cottage, I grabbed my flashlight and my shotgun, which I always kept by the door. My hands were shaking as I loaded the weapon, but I forced myself to step back outside. The property was silent, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. I shone the flashlight around the parking area, the barn, and the edge of the woods, searching for any sign of the creature. There was nothing, no tracks, no broken branches, no sign that anything had been there at all. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch with the shotgun across my lap, staring at the front door. Every creak of the old house made me jump, and I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see the creature's face peering in at me. But the night passed without incident, and when the first light of dawn broke over the trees, I finally allowed myself to relax. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or maybe some kind of animal had gotten onto the property, and I had misinterpreted its movements. But deep down, I knew those explanations didn't make sense. The way it moved, the way it stood on 2 legs, it wasn't natural. I started asking around, casually at first, to see if anyone in the area had seen anything unusual. Most people just laughed it off, or told me I'd probably seen a bear. But one older man, a local who had lived in the area his whole life, gave me a strange look when I described the creature. "You be careful out there," he said, his voice low. "There's things in these woods that don't like to be seen." I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and muttered something about staying indoors at night. His words stuck with me, and I found myself growing more paranoid as the weeks went on. Every time I stepped outside after dark, I felt like I was being watched, though I never saw the creature again. Months later, I moved to a different property for work, and I tried to put the experience behind me. But even now, years later, I still think about that night. I can still see the creature in my headlights, its long legs and matted fur, the way it ran like a man, but moved like something that didn't belong in this world. I don't know what it was or how it got onto the property, but I know what I saw. And I know that, no matter how much I try to convince myself otherwise, there are things in the woods that defy explanation. I'm 17 now, but some of the strangest things that have ever happened to me started when I was very young. I've always been interested in the paranormal, watching shows like Ghost Hunters and Paranormal Files growing up, but I never expected that I'd have my own stories to tell. These experiences have haunted me for years, and no matter how much I try to rationalize them, I keep coming back to the same chilling conclusion. Something has been following me, something I can't explain. I've tried to timeline everything as best I can, though some details are hazy. It's hard to piece it all together when the memories themselves feel like fragments of a nightmare you wake up from and try to forget. But here's what I remember. The first incident happened when I was around 6 years old. At the time, I was living with my grandmother in her small house on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina. It was a modest place, surrounded by tall oak trees draped in Spanish moss. My grandmother and I were very close, and I loved living with her. Her house always felt warm and safe, until that night. It was late, and my grandmother had let me sleep in her bed. I couldn't fall asleep, though. I remember lying there, staring at the ceiling, while she snored softly next to me. The room was dark, but the faint glow of the streetlight outside filtered through the window blinds, casting stripes of light across the walls. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. And then I heard it. A voice, clear as day, called my name from the kitchen. "Emily," it said in my grandmother's voice. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe she had woken up and needed something. But when I turned to look at her, she was still lying there, fast asleep. My heart started to race. I stared at her, willing her to wake up, but she didn't stir. The voice called again, louder this time. Emily. It sounded so real, so much like her, that for a moment I wondered if I was imagining things. I thought about getting up and going to the kitchen to see what she wanted, but something deep inside me, something primal, told me not to move. Instead, I scooted closer to her, pulling the blanket up to my chin, and kept my eyes locked on the open bedroom door. I stayed like that until the sun came up, too scared to move or even close my eyes. I never told my grandmother about it. At the time, I didn't have the words to explain what had happened, and as I got older, I convinced myself it must have been a dream. But now looking back, I'm not so sure. The next incident happened years later, when I was 13. My dad had taken me on a trip to the Grand Canyon. It was one of those family vacations that felt like a big deal at the time. My dad, my stepmom, and I all piled into a rental car, driving from one tourist attraction to the next. I loved the Grand Canyon. There was something about standing on the edge of that vast, open space that made me feel small in the best possible way. One afternoon, while my family was waiting in line for the Skywalk Bridge, I wandered off a little on my own. I didn't go far, just to a quiet spot along the edge where I could look out over the canyon without any distractions. The air was dry and still, and the only sounds were the occasional gust of wind and the distant murmur of other tourists. On a whim, I decided to yell my name into the canyon, just to hear it echo back. Emily! I shouted, my voice bouncing off the walls of the canyon and fading into the distance. I grinned. It was oddly satisfying, hearing my voice come back to me like that. But then on the second or third echo something changed. The sound that came back wasn't quite the same. It was distorted, warped, like a recording being played back at the wrong speed. And it didn't just sound like my voice. It sounded like my grandmother's. The smile disappeared from my face. I stepped back from the edge, my heart pounding. It couldn't have been her. She'd passed away years ago. But for one brief, terrifying moment, I was sure it was her voice echoing back to me, calling my name. I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't want my dad to think I was crazy. But the memory stuck with me, and even now, I can still hear that distorted echo in my mind. The most terrifying experience happened a year later, when I was 14. My family had rented a beach house in Key Largo for a week, and I had invited my best friend, Ellie, to come with us. Ellie and I had been inseparable since kindergarten, and I was excited to spend the week lounging on the beach and watching Netflix marathons with her. On the third day of the trip, my family went out on a boating excursion, but Ellie and I decided to stay behind. We spent the afternoon binge-watching some cheesy reality show, laughing and joking around like we always did. At some point, we decided to take a snack break. I got up to go to the kitchen, and Ellie followed me. Or at least, I thought she did. I was standing at the kitchen counter, pouring chips into a bowl, when I started chatting with her. She was leaning against the counter behind me, scrolling on her phone. I didn't think anything of it. I was so used to her presence that it felt natural to talk to her without even looking. But when I turned around to hand her the bowl of chips, she wasn't there. I froze, the bowl still in my hands. A second later, I saw her walk out of the bathroom down the hall. My stomach dropped. Ellie, I said, my voice trembling. How did you get in there? She gave me a confused look. What are you talking about? I've been in the bathroom the whole time. No, you weren't, I insisted. You were just here. I was talking to you. You were on your phone. Ellie stared at me like I'd lost my mind. I wasn't in the kitchen, Emily. I've been in the bathroom. I tried to explain what had happened, but the more I talked, the more ridiculous it sounded. Ellie laughed it off, joking about doppelgangers and how creepy it would be if there were two of her. But I wasn't laughing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in the kitchen with me, something pretending to be her. Since then, these experiences have only gotten stranger. Last summer, my family took a trip to the Smoky Mountains, and we stayed in a small cabin outside Gatlinburg, Tennessee. From the moment we arrived, the place felt off. The air was heavy, and the woods around the cabin were eerily quiet. The first night, we heard footsteps circling the cabin. At first, we thought it was just a deer or some other animal, but the steps were slow and heavy like a person pacing. My little brother swore he saw someone standing at the edge of the trees, but when we shone a flashlight in that direction, there was nothing there. The next day, while exploring the woods behind the cabin with my siblings, I heard someone calling my name. It was a woman's voice, soft and melodic, coming from deeper in the forest. My siblings heard it too, and we all froze, staring into the trees. "Mom," my little sister called out, her voice trembling. But it wasn't our mom. We ran back to the cabin as fast as we could, my heart racing the whole way. When we told my mom what had happened, she swore she hadn't called for us. None of us slept well that night. I've spent hours researching what these experiences could mean. Skinwalkers, mimics, spirits. I've read about all of them, trying to find answers. But the truth is, I don't know what's been following me all these years. All I know is that it sounds like the people I love, but it isn't them. And it's not going away. The year was 1995. I had just graduated high school and was lost in that brief moment of freedom between the end of childhood and the beginning of adulthood. My best friend, Jake, and I had been inseparable since we were kids, but as we grew up, life started pulling us in different directions. College, jobs, family obligations, we both knew things were about to change, and this might be one of the last times we'd have to just hang out, no responsibilities, no worries. So, on a whim, we decided to take a road trip. The plan was simple. We'd head south from our hometown in Arkansas, make our way to New Orleans, and see where the road took us from there. We didn't have much money, just $140 between us, but back then, that felt like more than enough. Gas was cheap, we had a beat-up old Honda Civic that ran well enough, and a sense of adventure that made up for anything we lacked in resources. The drive to New Orleans was uneventful if long. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the city was coming to life. The air was thick with humidity and the scent of fried food, and the streets were alive with music and chatter. It was overwhelming in the best way possible. We wandered through the French Quarter, taking in the sights and sounds, and even though we were just a couple of teenagers with no real plan, it felt like we were part of something bigger. But after a few hours, the excitement started to wear off. The crowds, the noise, it became too much. We weren't used to big cities, and the culture shock hit us harder than we expected. So we decided to leave. Our next stop was Magnolia, Mississippi, where we planned to crash at a cheap motel for the night. It wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet, and after the chaos of New Orleans, we needed that. We stayed up late that night, sitting on the sagging motel bed, playing poker with a deck of cards we'd picked up at a gas station. Jake had managed to sneak a bottle of cheap vodka into the room, and while we weren't exactly hardened drinkers, we each had a few sips and laughed at how awful it tasted. It felt like the kind of night we'd look back on years later with fondness, and in that moment, I didn't care about what came next. I just wanted to enjoy it. The next morning, we woke up groggy but eager to keep moving. Over breakfast at a little diner down the road, Jake pulled out the road atlas we'd been using to navigate. He traced a route with his finger, stopping at the Texas border. "Ever been to Texas?" he asked. "Nope," I said, taking a bite of my pancakes. "You?" He shook his head. "Wanna go?" I shrugged. "Why not?" And just like that, our plan changed. We packed up the car and headed west, toward the Lone Star State. The drive was long and uneventful, but by late afternoon, we found ourselves crossing the border into Texas. Our first stop was a small barbecue joint in Marshall, a quiet little town that felt worlds away from the chaos of New Orleans. We ordered pulled pork sandwiches and sweet tea, and for a while it felt like we were just two kids on a harmless adventure. But as the sun began to set, the mood shifted. We decided to take a detour, following a rural highway that wound through the woods and past Caddo Lake. It wasn't the most direct route, but it looked interesting on the map, and we figured it might be fun to explore a bit. The road was narrow and poorly lit, with sharp curves and steep hills that made it hard to see what was ahead. The trees pressed in on either side, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out what little light remained. At first, it was peaceful. The hum of the car engine, the occasional chirp of crickets, the cool night air wafting in through the open windows. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like the world had stopped for a moment. But as we drove deeper into the woods, that peaceful feeling began to fade. The air grew heavier, the darkness deeper. It felt like the trees were closing in around us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Do you feel that?" I asked, breaking the silence. Jake glanced at me. "Feel what?" "I don't know," I said, shrugging. "It just feels weird." He didn't respond, but I saw him grip the steering wheel a little tighter. We had been driving for about an hour when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a flicker of movement at the edge of the headlights. I thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but as I stared, I realized it was something else entirely. It was running alongside the car, just behind my window, keeping pace with us. "Jake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you see that?" "See what?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the road. "There's something," I started to say, but before I could finish, the thing moved closer, stepping into the light. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with long, matted fur that glistened in the moonlight. Its arms were muscular, its claws curved and black as obsidian. But what struck me the most was its face. It was twisted, animalistic, with glowing red eyes and a mouth full of jagged, yellow teeth. Saliva dripped from its jaws as it ran, its chest heaving with each stride. Jake saw it then. His eyes went wide, and he slammed his foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, the engine roaring as we sped down the narrow road. But the creature didn't fall behind. It kept pace with us, its long, powerful legs propelling it forward with terrifying ease. "Jesus Christ," Jake muttered, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I shouted, panic rising in my chest. "Just keep driving." For what felt like an eternity, the creature stayed with us, its glowing eyes locked on the car. I couldn't look away, even though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn my head. Its claws scraped against the asphalt, sending sparks flying into the air. "Faster!" I yelled, my voice trembling. Jake pressed the pedal to the floor, the speedometer climbing past 60, then 70. The trees blurred around us, and the car shook as we barreled down the uneven road. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the creature began to fall behind. Its strides grew shorter, its figure fading into the darkness. And then it was gone. We didn't slow down. We didn't speak. We just kept driving, the tension in the car so thick it was suffocating. It wasn't until we reached the lights of a small gas station on the outskirts of Texarkana that Jake finally pulled over. We sat in silence for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. My hands were shaking, and my heart was still racing. Jake lit a cigarette, his hands trembling as he brought it to his lips. "What the hell was that?" he asked, breaking the silence. I shook my head. "I don't know. I don't want to know." We didn't talk about it again for years. It wasn't until a random conversation, at a bar more than a decade later, that Jake brought it up. Even then, we only spoke about it briefly, as if saying too much might bring it back. To this day, I don't know what we saw on that road. Maybe it was some kind of animal. Maybe it was something else, something that doesn't belong in this world. All I know is that I'll never forget the way it looked, the way it moved, or the way it made me feel, like prey. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that remind us how small and vulnerable we really are. And sometimes, those things are closer than we'd like to believe. My family owns a modest farm in the northern plains, deep in the heart of a Lakota reservation. It's been in our family for generations, passed down from my great-grandparents. Growing up, the farm was my safe haven. Surrounded by rolling fields and dense woods, it felt like a world apart, far removed from the noise and chaos of modern life. But as much as I loved it, there was always something about the place that felt heavy. Like the land carried secrets it wasn't eager to share. It was winter when this happened, a bitterly cold December night. My parents had gone into Rapid City for Christmas shopping, leaving me to watch over the farm. I was 22 at the time, old enough to handle things on my own, and I didn't mind being alone. The house was warm, the wood stove crackling in the corner, and I had a stack of books to keep me company. Outside, the fields were blanketed in snow, the moonlight reflecting off the icy landscape and casting an eerie glow over everything. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping on a cup of coffee, when I heard it, the sound of cows bellowing in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a few restless animals, but the noise grew louder, more frantic. Something was spooking them. My stomach tightened. Wild dogs were a constant threat in the area, and they had been known to attack livestock. I grabbed my coat, slipped on my boots, and reached for the Winchester shotgun my dad kept by the door. I loaded it with trembling hands, the metallic click of the shells sliding into place echoing in the stillness of the house. The moment I stepped outside, the cold hit me like a slap to the face. The air was sharp and biting, my breath visible in the moonlight. I could hear the cows more clearly now, their cries echoing across the frozen fields. The sound was coming from the far pasture, near the edge of the woods. I started walking, the snow crunching beneath my boots. The moon was high, its pale light illuminating the landscape enough that I didn't need a flashlight. As I approached the pasture, I scanned the area, my eyes darting between the shadows. The fence line was intact, and the gate was closed. No sign of anything unusual, yet the cows were clustered in the corner of the field, their eyes wide and their breath fogging in the cold air. "What's got you all worked up?" I muttered, more to myself than to them. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just two large dogs. They were standing near the tree line, facing each other, their shapes barely visible against the darkness of the woods. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't dogs at all. They were too big, for one thing, easily 6 or 7 feet tall, even hunched over. Their bodies were covered in thick, matted fur that hung in clumps, and their limbs were unnaturally long, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. They were standing on 2 legs, facing each other like they were about to fight. I froze, my grip tightening on the shotgun. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. I didn't know what these things were, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around and run. Instead, I racked the shotgun, the metallic sound cutting through the still night like a knife. The creatures stopped. Slowly, they turned their heads to look at me, their glowing yellow eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then, without a sound, they turned and ran, on 2 legs, into the woods. I stood there, frozen in place, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. My mind was racing, trying to process what I had just seen. The way they moved, the way they looked, it wasn't natural. It wasn't right. When I finally snapped out of it, I realized the cows had quieted down. They were still huddled together, their eyes darting toward the woods, but the sense of panic had subsided. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the tree line, and made my way back to the house. Once inside, I locked every door and window, pulled the curtains shut, and sat down at the kitchen table with the shotgun across my lap. The fire in the wood stove crackled softly, but the warmth did little to calm me. I stayed like that for hours, staring at the door, listening for any sound that might indicate the creatures had come back. The next morning, I went out to check the pasture. The snow was untouched, no footprints, no signs that anything had been there. The cows were calm, grazing as if nothing had happened. It didn't make sense. I'd seen them. I knew I had. But there was no evidence to prove it. I decided not to tell my parents. They were practical people, and I knew they'd dismiss it as my imagination or chalk it up to a couple of stray dogs. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like there were eyes on me, just beyond the tree line. At night, strange noises echoed through the woods, low growls, distant howls, and once, a scream that sounded almost human. I started keeping the shotgun with me at all times, even during the day. I avoided going near the woods, and I made sure to lock the doors before the sun went down. But the unease never went away. One night, about a month after the first incident, I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, like something was brushing against the side of the house. Then it grew louder, more deliberate. The sound moved along the wall, stopping just beneath my bedroom window. I didn't dare move. I lay there, clutching the shotgun, my heart racing. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. When I finally worked up the courage to look out the window, there was nothing there. Just the empty yard, bathed in moonlight. I don't know what those creatures were, or why they seemed to be drawn to the farm. I don't know if they were some kind of animal, something from the woods that had never been seen before, or if they were something else entirely, something not of this world. What I do know is that they were real. I saw them. I felt their presence. And even now, years later, I can't think about that night without feeling a chill run down my spine. The farm is still in my family, though I don't visit as often as I used to. When I do, I can't help but scan the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. The woods are quiet now, but the memory of those creatures lingers, a shadow that refuses to fade. It was a few years ago when this happened, but I remember it like it was yesterday. My family and I had rented a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains, not far from Asheville, North Carolina. It was a spur-of-the-moment trip, something to break up the monotony of daily life. Our original vacation plans had fallen through, and this cabin was the only place we could book last minute. It wasn't exactly what we'd envisioned. We'd been hoping for something a little more modern and luxurious, but it was charming in its own way. Rustic, cozy, and isolated, perched on the side of a mountain with a stunning view of the valley below. When we arrived, it was late afternoon. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the dense forest that surrounded the cabin. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. It should have been peaceful. But the moment I stepped out of the car, A strange unease settled over me. The cabin itself was small but well kept, with a wraparound porch and a steeply pitched roof. It sat at the end of a narrow dirt road, with no other houses in sight. The nearest neighbor was supposedly up the hill, but we couldn't see their cabin through the trees. It felt like we were completely alone, surrounded by miles of wilderness. As we unloaded the car, a voice called out from somewhere in the woods. "Welcome, neighbors." It was a man's voice, loud and cheerful, but slightly distorted, as though it had been carried on the wind. My dad shouted a polite reply, and we all waved in the general direction of the voice, even though we couldn't see anyone. It seemed friendly enough, but something about it unsettled me. Maybe it was the way the voice echoed, or the fact that there was no sign of anyone nearby. I shook it off, telling myself I was overthinking things. After all, we were in the middle of nowhere. People were probably just friendlier out here. It wasn't like the suburbs where you'd barely nod at your neighbors. That night, we settled into the cabin. My parents took the master bedroom on the ground floor, while my younger brother and I shared the loft upstairs. The loft was small, with a pair of twin beds and a single window that overlooked the forest. It was cozy, but the shadows from the trees outside made the room feel darker than it should have. We spent the evening playing board games and roasting marshmallows in the fireplace. For a while, it felt like a normal family vacation. The strange feeling I'd had earlier started to fade, replaced by the warmth of the fire and the sound of my brother's laughter. But as the night wore on, the unease crept back in. It started with the footsteps. At first, I thought I was imagining it. A faint crunching sound, like someone walking through the leaves outside. I glanced at my parents, but they didn't seem to notice. My brother was too busy trying to cheat at Monopoly to pay attention to anything else. The footsteps grew louder, circling the cabin. They were slow and deliberate, each step sending a chill down my spine. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded human. "Do you hear that?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My dad paused, his hand hovering over the game board. "Hear what?" "Outside," I said. "It sounds like someone's walking around." He frowned and stood up, walking over to the window. He pulled back the curtain and peered outside, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the porch light. After a moment, he shook his head. "There's nothing out there," he said. "Probably just the wind." I wanted to believe him, but the sound didn't stop. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the footsteps as they circled the cabin. They didn't stop until just before dawn. The next day, we decided to explore the woods behind the cabin. My brother and I wandered off on our own, following a narrow trail that wound through the trees. The air was cool and damp, and the forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our footsteps crunching through the leaves. We hadn't gone far when we heard it, a voice calling my name. It was soft, almost melodic, and it seemed to come from deeper in the forest. My brother froze, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding. "Yeah. Do you think it's Mom?" he asked. I shook my head. The voice didn't sound like my mother's. It didn't sound like anyone I knew. But it was familiar in a way I couldn't explain, and that familiarity made it even more unsettling. "Let's go back," I said, grabbing his arm. We turned and hurried back toward the cabin, my pulse racing with every step. When we told my parents what had happened, my mom brushed it off, insisting that we must have imagined it. But my dad's expression was more serious. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he was worried. That night, the footsteps came back. This time, they were louder, more insistent, and accompanied by faint scratching sounds. It was as if someone, or something, was dragging their nails along the side of the cabin. I sat up in bed, clutching the blanket to my chest, my eyes fixed on the window. The moonlight cast pale beams across the floor, and every shadow seemed to shift and move. My brother was asleep in the bed across from mine, his breathing slow and steady. I didn't want to wake him. I didn't want him to panic. Then I heard the voice again. My name, spoken softly, almost lovingly, just outside the window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned to look at the window. The glass was fogged from the cold, but I could just make out the outline of something standing there. A shadow, tall and thin, its head tilted as if it were watching me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just sat there, staring at the figure, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, silent and still. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I told my parents what I had seen. My dad went outside to check, but there were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. He tried to reassure me, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He didn't believe me, not completely. That day, we decided to cut the trip short. We packed up the car and headed back home, leaving the cabin behind. None of us talked about what had happened. It was as if we were all trying to pretend it hadn't happened, like ignoring it would make it go away. My grandfather was a man of few words. He wasn't the type to sit around the dinner table spinning stories or reminiscing about the past. He carried himself with a quiet strength, the kind of man who didn't speak unless he had something worth saying. That's why, when he did tell me a story, I listened. And there was one story in particular that he told me when I was a teenager, a story that I've never been able to forget. It was late one summer evening, and we were sitting on the porch of his old ranch house in New Mexico. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and pink. The air was warm but cooling quickly, and the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of the wind through the sagebrush. I had asked him about the Valley of Shadows. I'd heard the name before, whispered among the locals, always with a tone of reverence or fear. It was an isolated canyon about 20 miles from his ranch, a place that even the ranch hands avoided. They said it was cursed, though no one ever explained why. I was young and curious, and I wanted to know the truth. At first, he didn't answer. He just stared out at the horizon, his face unreadable. Then he leaned back in his chair, lit a cigarette, and said, "There are places in this world that people aren't meant to go. The Valley of Shadows is one of them." I pressed him for more, and after a long pause, he began to tell me the story. It was the summer of 1952, and my grandfather was in his early 20s. He was working as a ranch hand back then, saving up money to buy his own land. The rancher he worked for often sent him out to check on the cattle in the far pastures, a job that took him deep into the desert, sometimes for days at a time. He didn't mind the solitude. In fact, he liked it. There was something peaceful about being out there with nothing but the open sky and the sound of the wind. One afternoon, he was riding his horse along the edge of the valley when he noticed something strange. The air felt heavier, the way it does before a thunderstorm, but the sky was clear. The birds were silent, and even the insects seemed to have disappeared. He couldn't explain it, but something about the place set his nerves on edge. He'd heard the stories, of course. The locals said the valley was cursed, a place where spirits lingered and strange things happened. They called it the Valley of Shadows because the sun never seemed to reach the bottom, no matter the time of day. But my grandfather wasn't the superstitious type. He chalked it up to old wives' tales and kept riding. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. As he rode deeper into the valley, he came across the ruins of an old adobe house. It was little more than a crumbling shell, the roof long gone and the walls partially collapsed. Animal bones littered the ground, and strange symbols were carved into the remaining stones, symbols he didn't recognize. He stopped his horse and dismounted, curiosity getting the better of him. The air was oppressively still, and the silence was almost deafening. As he approached the house, he heard it, a voice calling his name. "Tomas," it said, soft and distant. He froze, his hand instinctively going to the pistol on his hip. The voice was faint, but it was undeniably human. It sounded like his mother's voice, though she had been dead for years. "Tomas," the voice called again, louder this time. He turned in a circle, scanning the area, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to come from all around him, echoing off the canyon walls. His horse snorted and pawed at the ground, clearly spooked. That's when he saw them. At first, he thought they were just shadows, tricks of the light dancing on the canyon walls. But as he stared, the shadows began to take shape. They were human-like, but not quite human. Their forms were thin and elongated, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. They were watching him. He backed away slowly, his hand still on his pistol. The shadows didn't move, but he could feel their gaze, heavy and unrelenting. Then, without warning, one of them stepped forward. It moved toward him, its body shifting and flickering like smoke. His horse reared, nearly throwing him to the ground. He managed to grab the reins and calm the animal, but his heart was pounding in his chest. "What do you want?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. The shadow didn't answer. It just stood there, its glowing eyes fixed on him. He didn't wait to see what it would do next. He mounted his horse and rode out of the valley as fast as he could, the sound of hooves echoing in the silence. He didn't look back, didn't stop until he was miles away. When he finally reached the ranch, the foreman took one look at him and said, "You went into the valley, didn't you?" My grandfather didn't answer. He didn't need to. The foreman just shook his head and said, "You're lucky you made it out." After that day, my grandfather never went near the Valley of Shadows again. He warned others to stay away, though he never told them exactly what he had seen. He said most people wouldn't believe him, and those who did would be foolish enough to go looking for themselves. As he finished telling me the story, he took a long drag on his cigarette and looked me in the eye. "There are things in this world we're not meant to understand," he said. "The valley is one of them. If you're smart, you'll stay away." I nodded, too scared to ask any more questions. I could tell he wasn't just trying to scare me. He believed every word he said, and that belief was enough to keep me away from the valley. Years later, I found myself back in New Mexico visiting family. I was older then, more skeptical, and part of me wanted to see the valley for myself. I thought about driving out there, just to take a look. But every time I got close, something stopped me. A feeling, a memory, a voice in the back of my mind telling me to turn around. I don't know what my grandfather saw that day, and I don't think I ever will. But I believe him. There are places in this world that defy explanation, places where the rules don't apply. The Valley of Shadows is one of them. And some things are better left alone. This happened about 5 years ago. I was driving home from a friend's house late one night, heading down a long stretch of rural highway that cut through the backwoods of Indiana. It was one of those roads where you could drive for miles without seeing another car or even a streetlight. Just endless trees on either side, their branches arching over the road like a tunnel. The kind of road that gets under your skin if you spend too much time on it alone. I wasn't in a rush to get home. It was a warm summer night, and the air coming through the rolled-down windows was cool and refreshing. I had the radio on low, just enough to fill the silence, and the occasional hum of cicadas drifted in from outside. I'd driven this road dozens of times before, and while it could be a little unnerving, I always told myself there was nothing out there to be afraid of. But that night, I learned how wrong I was. It was a little after midnight, and the road was completely empty. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour, and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the darkness. The trees on either side of the road seemed to press closer than usual, their shadows stretching across the pavement like fingers reaching for the car. I was about halfway home when I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer. That's not uncommon in this area, especially at night. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a deer at all. It was standing on two legs, hunched over slightly, its long arms hanging at its sides. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and it looked too thin, like it hadn't eaten in weeks. Its head turned toward me as my headlights swept over it, and I slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt, coming to a stop about 20 feet away from the thing. My heart was pounding, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I just sat there, staring at it, my hands clenched around the steering wheel. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring back at me. Its eyes reflected the light from my headlights, glowing faintly like an animal's, but there was something about them that felt wrong. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were intelligent, aware, and they were watching me. For what felt like an eternity, we were locked in a silent standoff. I couldn't bring myself to look away, afraid that if I did, it would come closer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but nothing about it made sense. The thing was tall, easily over 6 feet, but its limbs were too long, its proportions all wrong. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in hands that looked more like claws. Its body was covered in patches of thin, wiry hair, and its chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths. And its face was the worst part. It was almost human, but not quite. The features were distorted, stretched, as if someone had taken a human face and tried to reshape it into something else. Its mouth was slightly open, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth, and its lips were pulled back in what I can only describe as a twisted grin. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in place, before the thing finally moved. It took a single step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was testing me. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my stomach drop. That was enough to snap me out of my daze. I threw the car into reverse and hit the gas, my tires squealing as I backed away. The thing stopped, tilting its head slightly, as if it were curious. Then it took another step forward. I kept reversing, my eyes darting between the thing in the road and the rearview mirror. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode, and sweat was dripping down the back of my neck. The thing didn't stop. It kept walking toward me, slowly but steadily, its glowing eyes locked on mine. I knew I couldn't keep reversing forever. The road was narrow, and I could barely see where I was going. If I didn't stop soon, I'd end up in a ditch, or worse. Taking a deep breath, I slammed on the brakes, shifted into drive, and floored the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, accelerating toward the thing in the road. For a split second, I thought it might move out of the way. It didn't. As I barreled toward it, the thing dropped down onto all fours, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it wasn't used to being in that position. It let out a sound that I can only describe as a mix between a growl and a scream, a sound so loud and so guttural that I felt it in my chest. I swerved to avoid it, my tires skidding on the pavement. The car veered off the road, the wheels bouncing over the uneven ground before I managed to regain control and pull back onto the asphalt. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the thing was gone. I didn't stop driving. I didn't slow down. I kept my foot on the gas, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. My heart was racing, and my mind was a blur of panic and confusion. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew I needed to get as far away from it as possible. The rest of the drive home was a blur. I don't remember much of it, just the sound of the engine and the feel of the steering wheel in my hands. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a long time, too shaken to get out of the car. The silence was deafening, and every shadow seemed to move, every sound seemed to echo with the memory of that thing. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I must have been tired or that it was a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I knew what I had seen, and I knew it wasn't something I could explain. For weeks after that night, I avoided driving on that road. I took the long way around, adding an extra 30 minutes to my commute just to avoid going near it. But eventually, I convinced myself that it was safe, that whatever I'd seen that night was gone. I was wrong. About a month later, I was driving home late at night again, this time on a different road. It was another quiet, rural highway, surrounded by fields and trees. I hadn't thought about the creature in weeks, and I was beginning to believe that maybe it had been a one-time thing, something I would never have to face again. But as I rounded a bend in the road, I saw it. It was standing on the shoulder, just outside the reach of my headlights, its glowing eyes watching me as I passed. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, its twisted grin visible even in the darkness. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I kept driving, my hands shaking and my heart racing, the memory of that thing etched into my mind. Black Hollow was the kind of place people didn't talk about, let alone visit. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, it was a forgotten stretch of wilderness overshadowed by dark folklore. Stories of strange disappearances and unexplainable sightings had circulated for over a century, whispered among hunters and hikers who dared to venture too close. The locals had a name for the creature that haunted Black Hollow: the Beast. I wasn't a believer, at least, not when I first heard the stories. I'd grown up in a small town just outside the mountains, where every bar and diner had its own version of the legend. Some said the beast was a massive wolf, others claimed it was part man, part animal, with glowing eyes and teeth like knives. But as a wildlife biologist, I dismissed these tales as nothing more than backwoods superstition. That was, until I saw it for myself. It started when I was hired to investigate a series of livestock killings near Black Hollow. A local farmer, Mr. Jacobs, had lost 3 cows and a dozen sheep in less than 2 weeks. The carcasses were found torn apart, dragged into the woods, with bite marks too large to belong to any known predator in the region. The authorities blamed coyotes or black bears, but Jacobs wasn't convinced. "This ain't no bear," he told me, his face pale and drawn. "Whatever did this, it's not natural." I arrived at Jacobs' farm early one morning, armed with a rifle and my field equipment. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth, and a light mist clung to the ground. Jacobs led me to the edge of his property, where the woods began. "It always comes from there," he said, pointing to the dark expanse of trees. "You can hear it at night. The howling. It don't sound like no animal I've ever heard." I nodded, trying to mask my skepticism, and went to work examining the remains of the sheep. The injuries were brutal, deep gashes that split the flesh like butter, bones snapped clean in half. Whatever had done this was strong. Very strong. But what puzzled me were the tracks. They were faint, half erased by the damp soil, but they were unlike anything I'd ever seen. The prints were massive, with long, clawed toes. Too big for a wolf. Too narrow for a bear. I followed the tracks into the woods. The deeper I went, the darker it became. The trees grew close together, their gnarled branches twisting overhead to block out the sun. The air was thick and still, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I kept my hand on the rifle slung over my shoulder, my senses alert. Something about the woods felt wrong, as if the land itself was watching me. After about an hour, I came across a clearing. In the center was a circle of stones, blackened by fire, with strange symbols carved into their surfaces. Animal bones were scattered around the area, some of them freshly broken. The smell of decay hung heavy in the air. My stomach turned, but I forced myself to kneel and examine the site. The symbols were crude but deliberate, and the bones, they didn't belong to just animals. I found what looked like a human femur half buried in the dirt. I stood quickly, my pulse racing. This wasn't just a predator's den. It was something else. Something darker. That's when I heard it. The howling. It started low, almost a growl, and rose into a long, mournful wail that echoed through the trees. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, deep and guttural, with a sharp, almost human edge. My blood ran cold. I gripped my rifle and spun around, scanning the tree line. The howling stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy footsteps. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer. I backed away from the clearing, my heart pounding. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. I raised my rifle and shouted, "Who's there?" No answer. The footsteps stopped. The forest was silent again, but the silence was worse than the sound. It was oppressive, like the woods were holding their breath, waiting. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back at the farm, panting and drenched in sweat. Jacobs was waiting for me on the porch, a shotgun in his hands. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said, his voice trembling. "No," I replied, shaking my head. "But I heard it. Something's out there." "That's the beast," Jacobs said. "It's been here longer than any of us. My granddaddy used to tell stories about it, how it'd come down from the hollow and take people. They say it's not just an animal. It's something else." I wanted to dismiss his words as paranoia, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He was terrified, and deep down I was too. That night, I decided to stay on the farm. I set up cameras near the edge of the woods, hoping to catch whatever was out there on film. Jacobs and I sat in the barn with the lights off, our weapons close at hand. The hours dragged by, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. Around midnight, the howling began again. It was closer this time, louder and more guttural, like the sound of an animal in pain. Jacobs gripped his shotgun tightly, his knuckles white. "It's coming," he whispered. The howling was followed by the sound of something crashing through the trees, heading straight for the farm. I grabbed my rifle and ran outside, my heart pounding. The cameras I'd set up were flashing, their motion sensors triggered, but the footage was grainy and unclear. All I could make out was a large, shadowy figure moving through the darkness. And then I saw it. The beast stepped into the moonlight, and my breath caught in my throat. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with a hunched, muscular frame covered in matted black fur. Its head was wolf-like, but its eyes glowed an unnatural yellow, and its mouth was filled with jagged teeth that dripped with saliva. Its hands, or claws, were long and gnarled, more human than animal, and its body moved with a strange, almost unnatural grace. It let out a low growl, the sound vibrating in my chest, and started toward me. I fired. The shot echoed through the night, and the beast recoiled, letting out an ear-piercing scream that sent shivers down my spine. But it didn't fall. The bullet had hit it square in the chest, but it barely seemed to notice. Instead, it lunged forward, its claws swiping through the air. I dove out of the way, landing hard on the ground. Jacobs fired his shotgun, the blast lighting up the darkness, but the beast was too fast. It disappeared into the woods, its howls fading into the distance. The next morning, I reviewed the footage from the cameras. Most of it was useless, just blurry shapes and static, but one clip stood out. It showed the beast emerging from the trees, its glowing eyes fixed on the camera. It moved with an intelligence that sent chills down my spine, like it knew exactly what it was doing. I took the footage to the authorities, but they dismissed it as a hoax. "Probably just a bear," one of them said with a shrug. "Or someone in a costume." But I knew the truth. I'd seen it with my own eyes, and so had Jacobs. The beast of Black Hollow was real, and it was still out there. I haven't been back to Black Hollow since that night, but the memories haunt me. The howling, the glowing eyes, the feeling of being hunted, it's all burned into my mind. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can still hear the beast's cries, echoing in the distance. And I know deep down that it's waiting. Watching. Hungry.